Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's webinar. I'm Alan Barrett, Director of the ESRI, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this morning's event. So, as you know, we are discussing the integration monitor. I just noticed this morning this is actually the ninth monitor. So, I think since about 2011, the ESRI, in collaboration with both the Department of Integration and the Department of Justice, we've been essentially tracking immigrants in Ireland over a period of time and seeing how well they're doing across a whole range of dimensions. So today's report is the ninth in that series, an important report in its own right, but probably additionally important in the context of building up that sort of body of information over time and tracking people over time. So over about the next hour and 15 minutes, we're going to have a presentation on the report from two of my ESRI colleagues I'll introduce in a moment. After the presentation, we'll be able to take maybe a quick few questions directly related to the presentation. So I'm going to encourage people already has thoughts strike you, feel free to put them into the Q&A function, and we'll try and relay them to the authors during the webinar. We'll also have some contributions then from a group of people, let me just sort of say, moving sort of from the academic research community into those with sort of closer experience, shall we say, of policy and service delivery in this area. And again, hopefully towards the end, we'll have a bit more time for Q&A. So with that, I'm going to call on my colleague, Ciara Murphy, to begin the presentation. So over to you, Ciara. I presume you're going to share a few slides as well.
Yeah, hopefully Evan can, brilliant, thanks Evan, share the slides. Good morning, everyone. And thank you all so much for joining. So as Alan said, we're going to be presenting the monitoring report on integration this morning on behalf of all of the authors. So this report was led by Frances McGinnity, who unfortunately can't be with us today. So we're presenting on her behalf and on behalf of all of the authors. Thanks. Evan, you can move on. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give a really brief introduction and context of the report, and then Evan's going to bring you through employment, education, social inclusion indicators of integration, and I'll bring you through active citizenship and conclude very briefly. This report is part of the research programme on migration, integration and equality, which is a relatively new research programme. It's a joint programme between DCD and the Department of Justice. This programme runs from 2024 to 2027, but it's a follow-on from a previous programme that was initially funded under the Department of Justice and then moved into the Department of Children. What has happened with this joint research programme is there's an increasing focus on the migration side as well as the integration side. So there's upcoming research on subjects such as public perceptions of immigration, a spatial analysis of migration, and a long-term project on integration outcomes under the Irish Refugee Protection Programme. But there's kind of rolling projects being agreed with the steering board on a regular basis based on policy priorities and areas of interest and data that's available. I think it's really important before going into the report to actually ask the question of what is integration. It's a term that we use a lot. So just the definition that the EU uses is a two-way process of mutual accommodation by all immigrants and residents. I actually quite like the Irish term that was agreed in the 2017 strategy, which expired in 2021. I think it can help to really think about integration in a more concrete way, the ability to participate to the extent that a person needs and wishes in all the major components of society without having to relinquish his or her own cultural identity. So when we're talking about integration, often what we're talking about is some kind of indicators of integration or things that make integration easier. And then when we get to the question of how we measure it, usually the answer is the Zaragoza indicator. So in 2010, ministers of integration gathered in Spain and agreed on indicators around priority areas of integration. So these are common European indicators across areas including employment, education, active citizenship, and social inclusion. And then the monitoring report integration, as Alan mentioned, is the ninth report in the series. It's been running since 2011. Basically, the idea of the report is to use similar indicators and methodology to enable monitoring over time. And these are the Zaragoza indicators that we use. And it's based on large-scale representative surveys plus administrative data where that's available or where we feel that that's necessary. And there can also be kind of deep dives in certain areas where that's relevant. One really important caveat is that collective accommodation is excluded from these large-scale representative surveys. They're not focused on migrant integration. They are kind of general surveys to look at labor force and to look at living conditions in the country. So they're not designed for migrant integration. And what we do in this report is we look at the outcomes for people born in Ireland and people born outside of Ireland. Sometimes we use Irish, non-Irish, so we look at citizenship instead of where people were born, where the data requires. And actually, it used to be that the monitor exclusively looked at citizenship more or less. But we switched that because migrants have quite high naturalization rates in Ireland. So we were missing a large cohort of people that we really wanted to be including when we were focusing only on citizenship. One really important thing to note is that neither of these are perfect. So the born abroad measure is also not a perfect measure of who we want to be capturing. It captures people, for example, born in Northern Ireland, who might consider themselves might be Irish citizens from birth, and also who might consider themselves very Irish. And it also captures people born abroad to Irish immigrants who may have been raised their entire lives in Ireland. So, there's always compromises to be made in these choices. I'll also just give a little bit of context on migration trends. It's really important when we're talking about integration to ask the question of kind of who is integrating. So this is a graph of immigration, emigration, and net migration, which is immigration minus emigration over the last 25 years. And what we really see is obviously, there's a response to economic cycles happening very strongly here. But what we see is that we're still below the peak of the 2007 immigration, just below it. It's very similar, but we're actually quite far below the peak of the net migration that we were seeing in 2007 because emigration is higher. And it's important to note that emigration is not just of Irish citizens, it's also of people who are citizens of other countries who have previously moved to the country. To just going a little bit deeper, and I think this is a really important point for integration, is where people are immigrating from. So what we really see, the yellow here is EU citizens, except for Irish and UK, which are the green and the red, and blue is citizens from outside the EU. And what we really see is that immigration was dominated by EU citizens before the crash, but that has never really recovered since the crash, and we're seeing a lot more immigration from outside the EU. And that has implications for integration because of things like, access to rights and policies, as well as cultural distance, all of which, and things like language, all of which are relevant to integration. So with that little bit of context, I will pass over to my colleague Evan to present some of the findings of the report.
Hi everyone. It's good to be talking to you this morning. And yes, I'm going to start off with employment. I'm going to talk about education and then social inclusion, which is looking at poverty and housing costs primarily. So to get started on employment, hold on. Good. To get started on employment, first I'm going to start with some definitions. These can be a little bit unintuitive if you're not familiar with them already, but first we start off with the employment rate. So here we're looking at the percentage of working age people, age 15 to 64, who are in work. This is the main indicator that we look at. This is essentially just out of everyone who's of that age group, how many are in work. Next, we look at the labor force. So this is all people who are in work or looking for work. We don't talk about this directly, but this is something that's important for essentially our next two definitions, which is the activity rate, or you might know it as the labor market participation rate, and the unemployment rate. So first of all, we define the activity rate as the percentage of the working age population who are in the labor force. And then next, we look at the unemployment rate, which is, and this is crucial to understand, this is the percentage of the labor force that's not in work. So the unemployment rate and employment rate aren't kind of opposite. So they're not like, they don't sum to 100% because just someone being out of work doesn't mean that they're unemployed. If you're not looking for work, then you're considered inactive. But if unemployment is essentially where people are looking for work, trying to get work, but can't get it, And so this will help us understand the headline statistics on labor market integration. So this comes from Q1 of 2024, and we see a kind of continuation of essentially the same state that we've seen for a long time, and for migrants or for foreign-born people in Ireland, which is they have higher employment, higher unemployment, and higher activity rates. So if we just start with the employment and activity rates, trying to understand why those might be higher. Essentially, we don't talk directly about this in the report, but we think that things like differences in the amount of, maybe migrants are potentially, you might think, might be less likely to have children, less likely to have older adults who can't work that they're taking care of, retirees in the family. They're also, and this is something that we do find we have evidence of, is that migrants tend to be healthier because migration is a challenging process, and it takes it's quite a big quite a big process to go through. So you're less likely to see people with long-term issues such as disabilities or long-term health issues that might affect people's activity in the labor market and then their employment. So you can see then why it might make sense that migrants or foreign-born people, as we define them here, have higher employment and higher activity rates. Now, why might they have higher unemployment as well? It's something similar. So if you think about the people who are out of work in the Irish-born population compared to the people who are just out of work in the foreign-born population, it might be that it's more likely, essentially, that those who are foreign-born and out of work are more likely to be looking for work. So we know that migrants have much less access to social welfare, so they essentially will need work to get back on their feet at any given point. Also, a lot of them come on, a lot of people come on employment permits where they need to stay in work, or they come for work. So migrants who are foreign-born people who are out of work are more likely to also be looking for work, and so that is potentially a strong reason as to why they also see higher unemployment. So that's, it might be a little bit unintuitive to think of a group having both higher employment and higher unemployment at the same time. But those are kind of the key reasons behind what we see with these headline statistics. Now, considering employment by group, so first of all, going to think about those that have higher employment. So we see, and this is again, we're just going to focus on employment for this section because with three statistics, this is kind of perhaps the most straightforward to interpret. We see higher employment for those born in the EU, those born in Asia, and those born in the rest of the world. Now, the rest of the world is obviously not an ideal category to be working with, but we have these come from the data that we have, and this is the lowest level that we can get down to. Rest of the world includes essentially South America and most of the Middle East and some other territories. But as you'll see, it's defined essentially as those not in these other groups. So those with similar employment to the Irish-born group are those born in the UK, those born in Africa, and those born in North America, Australia, and Oceania, right? And finally, the only group that we see lower employment for are those born in Europe, but not in the EU. So just thinking about key developments since previous monitors or over the last number of years, we see quite a positive development in African employment and as well positive development in unemployment there too, where since 2022, which is the last report, we saw an increase in employment and a decrease in unemployment for African-born people. And this is quite positive and indicates kind of a greater level of labor market integration. We also, on the other hand, see a large decrease or a large increase in unemployment, I should say, and I should also add a decrease in employment as well for those who are born in Europe but not EU. Now, as Kira said, the question is this related to beneficiaries of temporary protection from Ukraine? Potentially. We don't know how many are in the data. We essentially don't know their status or their status of being in the country. But what we do know is that a lot of IP applicants and also beneficiaries of temporary protection who are, refugees from Ukraine, we know that a lot of those won't be in this data because they live in communal accommodation. But anyone in private accommodation, in theory, could be in this data and might be something of an explanation. As people are coming to Ireland, they have the right to work through the beneficiary protection status. And so perhaps they're looking for work, and that's improving the unemployment rate or increasing the unemployment rate. But it also indicates that more people in that group are looking for work but can't get jobs, which is a challenge and something that should be noted. It's quite a large development there. So moving on quickly then to education. This is where we might start to get a little bit more of a taste of what kind of jobs people are doing and what kind of skills they have. So just starting off very simply with the percentage of each group that has tertiary education. So these blue bars here represent the percentage for the age group 25 to 34. The orange dot then represents the age group 15 to 64. That's your working age population. We tend to focus here on the younger group because I guess access to third level education has been more even across that time, and also it's been more required for more jobs. So it's kind of maybe a fair comparison. But it's also closer to those Zaragoza indicators that Kira mentioned. So if we look at the Irish born compared to foreign born, these are just the first two on the left-hand side of your screen. We see that foreign born people of that age group have 70% tertiary education compared to 58% for Irish born. And now looking at the rest of these groups, these are all the groups that we have, we see essentially that this is being driven by those in EU West, so Western EU, and outside the EU. Those born in the UK have roughly similar, a little bit lower, but roughly similar tertiary education rates. Those born in Eastern Europe have much lower, around 40%. But and this would be important for interpreting and understanding some stuff later. You can see that EU West, but particularly some of the place of birth groups outside the EU, and particularly Asia, is 91% tertiary education rate. So that gives you a kind of a sense of the skill levels or the education levels of those arriving in Ireland or those born elsewhere living here. Now, it should be said that the relationship between migration and education is a bit complicated. So the question is as well, migration to Ireland for education is quite common, and it's quite a large proportion of migrants that come to Ireland, which is a little bit unusual in a European context. So the question is, are well-educated migrants coming here and doing jobs for employment, or are migrants being educated here? Are they coming for, say, third level education or English language education? And how does that differ between groups? As you see, it depends on the country of origin. And we compare tertiary education rates of those who finished education abroad and those who finished education in Ireland. So if you imagine in each group, each place of birth group, we split them into two, those who finished their education abroad and those who finished it in Ireland. And we see two key kind of takeaways. One is for those born in North America, Australia, and Oceania, and those born in EU West. Those who finished their education abroad have higher tertiary rates than those who finished in Ireland. So this might indicate, that a lot, like on relatively, they're migrating with their degrees, with their tertiary degrees, and taking job, using those degrees and jobs potentially. But they're migrating with those degrees. And then we see those born in EU East who are the only group who have lower tertiary rates than those who finished their education in Ireland. So that might indicate that those born in EU East who are coming, who arrive in Ireland, then if they finish their education here, they're more likely to have higher level education, tertiary education. So they're potentially you can see how that dynamic kind of influences how education and migration are related. Quickly, we'll talk about early school leaving. So we look here at the proportion of 18 to 24-year-olds who left school early. There's very little difference between the foreign-born and Irish groups here in total. And finally, we look at the OECD's PISA study, which tracks the achievement levels of 15-year-olds in schools across the OECD. They find that migrant origin children, and here we're not talking about place of birth, but migrant, they have their own definition. They also look at first and second generation migrants, which we don't have for most statistics in the support. They find lower scores than Irish children on reading and maths tests. So now taking all that information that we have about employment and about education, I think that can be quite a useful context for understanding what we're going to look at now, which is social inclusion. Here we're focusing on poverty first and then housing. And so we'll see now how these different kind of, I guess, background characteristics about these groups influences income, poverty levels, and how that's related to essentially the access to the resources that you need to integrate society. So the first indicator that we look at is median equivalized after-tax income, which is a bit of a mouthful. But the key thing to understand is that it's the median after-tax income, so it's disposable income, adjusted for the number of dependents in the household and their age. So because migrants and Irish-born families, foreign-born families and Irish-born families may have different compositions, Irish-born families might be more likely to have dependents, such as young children or adults that they're taking care of. And so they might be more likely to have those. So we have to adjust for that to essentially account for the fact that there's a greater demand on resources within those families, right? So we account for that. We also look then at poverty. So there's three measures for poverty. The first is at risk of poverty, where your income, your equivalized income, is less than 60% of the national average income. Then material deprivation, where you ask about 11 essential items for social inclusion, essentially. And if you can't afford two or more of those, you're said to be materially deprived. Consistent to poverty, then, which is the official definition of poverty, that's where you're both at risk of poverty and experiencing material deprivation. So that's a lot to take in, but it makes sense when we go through each of the statistics. First of all, median equivalized after-tax income. Migrants on average have a lower. So we see foreign-born people have lower, 24,000 compared to 27,000. This is driven almost entirely by those born EU East and outside the EU. We don't see any significant differences for the others. So that's driven primarily by those two groups. When we look at poverty statistics, it's a similar situation. So at risk of poverty, we see the foreign-born population have a higher 15% compared to 11% of Irish-born. And this, in this case, is driven entirely by those outside the EU, non-EU. Of 20% are at risk of poverty. Material deprivation. Now, in this case, all migrant groups except EU West are higher on this score. But you can see just how much higher it is. 16% for Irish-born, 23% for foreign-born, and it's in and around that for both of EU East and non-EU, which are the two groups that I want to highlight here. And finally, consistent poverty. Again, you see here the only two groups that are significantly higher on this are EU East and non-EU, and that's 6.3% to 7% compared to only about 4% in the Irish-born population. So moving on now to kind of take these poverty statistics and look at how they relate to housing, which is obviously it's a massive issue in Ireland. I think these are some of the most interesting statistics in the report, some of the most stark in the report. First thing we need to look at is the proportion of the private rental sector. So we can see here now that foreign-born people are by far, far much more likely to be in the private rental sector. This is true across all groups, particularly again EU East and non-EU, which are experience the highest challenges with poverty already before we consider housing cost. And this reliance on a private rental sector that has severe affordability issues drives even more, these drive the housing affordability issues for migrants. So we have two things we look at. The first is simply just housing cost in relation to your income. So if you're spending more than 30% of your income on housing, then you're considered to have a housing affordability issue. And we see here it's around 10% for Irish-born and then gets higher for each migrant group as you go through them there. With non-EU, 1 in 2 migrants that were surveyed here experience spending more than 30% of their housing cost and income. But that is a limitation insofar as if you have a really high income, then you might still be able to live comfortably, even if you are spending a lot of your money on housing. So we also look at the at-risk of poverty rate after housing. So again, this is looking at, is your income, once you include housing, does your income reach the poverty income threshold? Essentially, is housing driving you into poverty? And we see that indeed for a lot of the statistics quite high across the board, but in particular, again, about 45% for non-EU born people experiences are at risk of poverty after you include housing costs. So again, I do think these are some of the most stark and most worrying findings of the report. There's a lot of positives here, but these housing affordability issues that affect really everyone in Ireland, especially everyone who's dependent on the private rental sector, they're a massive issue for migrants. So one final thing that I want to point out is if you remember the tertiary education rates for those aged 25 to 34, you'll see here now that we have highlighted EU East and those not born in the EU, born outside the EU, as having issues with poverty and lower incomes and also housing affordability issues. Now we can see that education rates are relatively low for those born in EU East. So maybe this explains that they're in lower paying jobs, or maybe they don't have the degrees that would access the incomes that would allow them to move out of poverty. But if you look at this entire non-EU group, you can see all of them have much higher rates of tertiary education than those born in Ireland. So there may be, this is something we'll come back to, but you're thinking of issues now about lack of recognition of qualifications, maybe also English language service provision. This is a crucial issue to keep in mind, is that even though their education is quite high, they're experiencing some of the highest challenges in relation to poverty that we find in this report. So I'll hand back to Ciara now to talk about active citizenship.
Thanks so much, Evan. So active citizenship is the final group of indicators around these Zaragoza indicators that we mentioned, and it looks at a few different things. So one of the things that it looks at is the naturalization rate. So this is people acquiring Irish citizenship through naturalization. And what this tells us is not just it doesn't just tell us things about policies around naturalization, so how accessible is naturalization and citizenship for migrants, but it also tells us a lot about kind of how connected do migrants feel to the host society. It tells us a lot about what rights they're accessing, how long they're staying, and how long they plan to stay as well. So Evan, can you thank you. So really what we're seeing in the citizenship acquisition is a drop in the proportion of people who have naturalized. And that is for the most part because we're seeing actually an increase even though we're seeing an increase in the number of certificates issued, we're also seeing an increase in recent immigration. So kind of the base that this indicator is based on is getting higher. And when you have quite a bit of recent immigration, citizenship takes 5 years to acquire rights for people who are kind of building up rights to citizenship. So really what this is telling you is also kind of past immigration. So you're kind of seeing a lag. So where there's recent immigration, you're going to get lower proportions. We also once again see a very low proportion of people on long-term residence permits, and this is to do with quite a restrictive long-term residence permit program in Ireland that's been flagged for many years in the report, in particular compared with naturalization. So kind of the conditions for accessing both are relatively similar, but long-term residence is actually quite restrictive. So we tend to see a lot more people go towards naturalization in Ireland, and you can see the difference in those in other countries with the MIPEX indicators, which are indicators of integration policy. What we see in 2023 is that the most common nationalities for citizenship acquisition were India, Nigeria, and Pakistan. And it's actually the first year since Brexit that the UK has not been in the top 3. So we're kind of seeing the tapering off of UK nationals acquiring citizenship. And we see that, yeah, Evan, you can go on. The median processing is now 15 months for a citizenship application, which is still quite high, but it's down from 24 months in 2021. So there's progress being made, and there's been quite a few policy changes around that to try to get that number down. What we look at in active citizenship is also kind of political representation and political participation. So this is taken from Immigrant Council of Ireland reports, and it's looking at migrants in local elections. And what we see is an increase in the number of migrant candidates in the local elections in 2024, so from 56 to 120. And what we see is 2.2% of elected councillors, according to the Immigrant Council of Ireland, were migrants. That does, of course, compare to 22% of residents born abroad. So it's still relatively low compared with the overall number. But political participation and election is one of the kind of the highest levels of integration. So there's progress being made there. But this survey did also find high reports of harassment, violence, and abuse when they surveyed candidates for local elections as well. So some concerns there. We also looked at volunteering in this report. Census 2022 asked about volunteering, and we found that Irish citizens were more likely to volunteer, but that is almost entirely driven by sports volunteering. And what we see is that Africans were actually higher as a group. So some groups were actually higher in volunteering than others. And what we see is that for migrants, religious and social or charity volunteering were particularly common, whereas sports volunteering was very, very common among the Irish population. So that is a whirlwind tour of active citizenship. And now I'm going to just make some concluding comments before we open up for Q&A. So if you do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and Alan will ask. So really the key takeaways from this report that there are some positives some positive indicators of immigrant integration and other areas of concern. The positives, I think, as you probably noticed, were things like employment and labor market activity. Again, work is one of the main reasons that people migrate, so it's unsurprising that we're seeing higher rates of those. The proportion with third level education, which likely reflects quite a selective type of migration to Ireland. We would have seen historically the critical skills occupation list selecting for higher skill levels, improved local election representation, and relatively high rates of volunteering, in particular for some groups. Areas of concern then were really around housing affordability. So very, very high rates of housing affordability issues around poverty in particular for some groups, and things like reading and maths, lower reading and math scores at 15. The caveat, of course, of these takeaways is that this excludes collective accommodation, and it's based on those born abroad, which might capture some people who might not necessarily define themselves as migrants. So that's important for understanding this. The policy implications then of this report. I think what's really important here is that there are some mainstream issues that emerge very clearly from the report as being an issue for migrant integration, and then some more specific migrant-specific issues. So addressing both of those is really important. And the mainstream, of course, housing emerged very strongly and clearly. An unaffordable rental sector and kind of a lack of availability of housing is really disproportionately affecting migrant groups. So that's a really important part of integration policy as well, dealing with those mainstream issues. But then also targeted issues. So we're seeing things like high poverty among a highly educated group, so potentially issues with recognition of qualifications or kind of language provision, and maybe more understanding that better. Of course, an integration strategy. So the last integration strategy expired in 2021, and so trying to kind of address these issues, and clearly there are some issues there. Data for monitoring integration is something that we raise every time we publish this report. This report is based on surveys that are not intended to monitor integration of migrants. They are intended for other things, and we use them for monitoring the integration of migrants. But it means that, for example, collective accommodation centres aren't included, kind of migration status isn't included, but also migrant-specific questions that might get at integration also haven't been included. And so either migrant specific surveys or boost samples, because some of the numbers of migrants that you end up in a mainstream survey can be quite small. And one thing to flag is that this is kind of a really helpful overview, but it should be understood with other work under the program as well as more broadly. So integration is a two-way process. We've done quite a lot of work in the program on understanding attitudes and perceptions. So understanding the other side of the two-way process, spatial work. So this is national level, but some regions might experience quite different outcomes than others. And then deep dive reports to really understand what's happening. So there was one on housing and family, so looking at more deeply at the housing question, and one on wages, so looking more deeply at the labour market question. And that is it from us. So I think we're going to take,
Yeah, thanks so much, Ciara, and thanks earlier, Evan. A couple of questions did come through in the Q&A, but my colleague Anusha was very, very quick and was answering them by through the written method. But Anusha, can I just put one of the questions back to you, because others might be interested in the answer. So the question was specifically, when we did that adjustment, or at least when you guys did the adjustment for what's called housing cost, is that just mortgage and rent, or is it broader housing cost? So do you mind just giving us a insight into that one?
Yeah, so it's rent and mortgage interest. So then the money that's needed to pay for electricity, etc. That's within the income after housing costs. So this is used for that.
Perfect. Okay, thanks for that. There was another question actually where somebody had asked, could they be emailed a copy of the report? But just for everybody's purposes, the report is on the ESRI website. And I think because it was published last Friday on the front page of the ESRI website, it's sort of the most recent publications. So you shouldn't have to go digging too far to find it. You'll find it very readily if you go on the website. Okay, so I'm going to invite people to put more questions into the Q&A function, and we will go back to them. But right now I want to bring in our panelists who are going to sort of reflect more broadly on this this. So we've asked each of our panelists essentially to sort of reflect on the report, to sort of distill for them what are the key messages, particularly with reference to the areas in which they work, and also to sort of reflect on policy issues, both sort of policies that are required and maybe policies that haven't worked or have worked or whatever. So with that, I'm going to call on Colm O'Loughlin from the Department of Children, Quality, Disability Integration and Youth. And of course, Colm's department are one of the sort of the sponsoring bodies. So we're delighted to have you here, Colm, and we'll look forward to your reflections.
Yep, thanks very much, Alan, and thanks to Evan and Ciara for presenting the at least some of the findings there, and more importantly for all the work on the report. As you mentioned, Alan, ESRI were good enough to give me a bit of direction so that I wouldn't ramble too much in my comments. So, look, given this kind of scope and detail in the report, I've made a few written notes, and the audience will have to excuse me if I look down every now and then to refer to those. So the first question was really just to reflect in a broad sense on the findings in the context of the work we do here in the department and across other departments, I suppose. I suppose the first thing probably that jumped out at me were the kind of commonalities and how consistent the findings of this report were with the two consultations that we have conducted in the department on the new migrant integration strategy. So Ciara referenced we're due and we're overdue a new migrant integration strategy. So we've held public consultation end of 2023, and then we actually held a more targeted consultation during last year because we felt there were quite a few migrant groups who were underrepresented first time around. So that was our attempt to kind of plug the gaps there. So just to give you some examples of the commonalities, the issue of recognition of qualifications came across very strongly as it does in the ESRI report. That's one. The importance of access to language classes is very important. We know how language can kind of unlock integration in so many ways. So access to the labour market, social integration, social cohesion, all these things. So that's important. So we're looking at how we can be more kind of consistent in provision of language classes and have a more uniform approach across the country in that area. The third kind of thing, which is maybe common between our consultation and the ESRI, the process of applying for citizenship, obviously it takes a long time. It's expensive to many people, or prohibitively expensive to some people. And it was always, for a long time, it's been considered very, very onerous process. I think we've made some strides in the last couple of years on that. It's obviously the introduction of an online application process is a big step. Still quite expensive. We'll look at what we can do in that area. But they're just kind of additional comments on those commonalities. You're going to have to excuse me. There's a bit of construction noise outside. I'm hoping it's not coming through too intrusively there.
Actually, no, we can't hear it, Colm. It's probably a bit distracting for you, actually. But we can't
just
hear
a
loud and clear. Yeah,
I'm glad everyone else is not there, so that's good. I suppose in terms of the value of the report to us, look, the report has a very clear value. I think, as you said, it's the 9th in the series, so we've got this kind of body of research and evidence on integration in this country now. And it has a very clear value in informing how we draft the new migrant integration strategy. And I think a lot of people on the call will know that that strategy will now actually be a little bit broader. So it's a commitment in the programme for government that we develop what in the programme for government is called a migration and integration strategy. So a bit broader maybe than the previous one, and hopefully more encompassing. So look, the report feeds directly into that in a very meaningful way. Something to pick up on something Ciara mentioned in her kind of wrap up or the discussion on policy response, and something that challenged very much with us. Look, we need a combination of the mainstream responses on areas such as housing, which is such a challenge for the country as a whole and such a big ticket issue, if you like. So that's mainstream, but we also need some more targeted measures, and provision of language classes maybe an example of that. I think something else that came through to me, the ASRI report kind of highlights the importance that any new migrant integration strategy or migration integration strategy needs to cohere and be consistent with other strategies. And the National Action Plan Against Racism is maybe the top of mind to me on that one, because it actually sits within my unit as well. So look, both those strategies will be under the same roof as they are at present, but after the kind of transfer of functions to the Department of Justice. So I think that's good news. And then for some of the other strategies, we will obviously have very kind of clear links and contacts with what will become Department of Children and Equality and Disability. So look, I think we're very conscious of that, and we'll aim to make sure that the strategies speak to each other, as it were. And then just one, maybe just something that jumped out at me from the report and something to mention, and it's something most people would have known beforehand, but it highlights, so we've gone between 2021 and 23, the increase in the population born outside the state has jumped 20% to 22%. And I think you can see that figure and almost brush past it, but it's hugely significant. And time didn't allow this morning, but I did intend to go back and look how quickly that's happened in terms of kind of single figures to 20%, 22%. Are we tracking for a quarter of the population born outside the state, which is a huge jump in a short space of time. And I think maybe that's, sometimes we have to pause for thought and say, look, possibly, given how quickly that's happened, we're not doing quite as badly on integration as some would have us believe. So we have to recognize that that's quite a huge impact in a short space of time. So that's the kind of the immediate reflections. I hope I'm okay for time, Alan. I probably spent a bit too long on that one.
No, you're absolutely fine, Colin. And
okay. So I'll keep going. So the second kind of question or prompt that the ESRI put to me was to reflect on the main policy priorities or changes that we might need to do better on migrant immigration in Ireland. On the changes first, I suppose, and this is something probably called out in the report as well. I think we do need a more effective cross-government approach. It's not something we've always done terribly well in this country across many areas, but I think there's a very kind of there's a recognition at senior government levels and at very senior levels in government departments that does need to happen. You don't fix these issues without proper cross-government working. So I think that's a change that's needed. I think we are moving in that direction. So the very fact that the research program which supported this piece of research is now a joint effort between my current Department of Justice and ASRI, I think that gives you a bit of a signal that we're working together a bit better on this. And again, some of the people on the call would be aware there's a new strategic migration policy group led by the Department of Justice, which is meeting monthly at the moment, and that's intended to bring all the relevant departments together to kind of discuss exactly how we do that, how we work better across government on these issues. So I think we're at 8 or 9 departments at the moment, and probably room for a couple of more. So I think that's a change that's needed, but happening in a positive sense. In terms then of the priorities, look, I'm just going to mention housing, and I'm not going to call it the elephant in the room, and I'm not really going to try and kick off a debate on it. There may be colleagues from the Department of Housing on it on the call here, and obviously they're more than welcome to pitch in. But look, housing is something we need to tackle. Beyond, obviously far beyond the area of migrant immigration, but whatever progress we can make on housing will obviously be of particular benefit to the migrant population, given the fact that they're the disadvantages that Evan spoke about in terms of partly because of the reliance on the rental sector and so on. So look, housing a priority. I think again, to go back to that more consistent, more uniform approach to provision of language classes. I think that's a priority for us and has to be. To go back to that common issue again, recognition of qualifications. I think we know that so many migrants are working in jobs for which they're overqualified, and partly that's due to the difficulty of having qualifications recognised and the kind of the fact that it's an onerous process to do so. So look, that's an area we're focused on. And I think maybe one more priority, and again, just to pick up on something in the report, we've seen an increase in participation in politics, so that we've had more people run for local elections and more people successful, but admittedly from a very low base. And the report points that out. I think there's probably more we can do in that area. So that's priorities and changes. And then finally, the final kind of prompt was any progress in supporting migrant integration in recent months or years. So there's probably a few things jump out on that. I think the establishment of the LATEs, as they're called, the local authority integration teams, that's a big step, an important measure. And so we've now got at least partial teams in all 31 local authorities. That'll continue to expand over the course of this year. And I think that's an important step in a recognition that, we know this is a kind of is no surprise to anyone, but we know that integration, to happen effectively, it needs to happen at the local level. So by putting the resources in to the local authorities, I think that's such an important step, and that's real progress. Again, on citizenship, I think there have been a few important reforms on the process of application for citizenship in the last couple of years, and that's real progress. My department will also handle quite a few funding streams to support integration. So I'll just mention a couple of those from the last couple of years. So as some will know, we have a new national programme for AMIF, which is the EU's Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund. And I think we've been quite successful in maintaining a focus on integration in that. I think in some member states, the integration element of AMIF has shrunk in the course of developing the most recent national programme. I think we've retained that. We've allocated 10 million to a funding call for NGOs to support integration. Those projects are up and running. That's important. Another recent development, the IP Integration Fund. So that's a more kind of focused fund, particularly on helping applicants for international protection or helping organisations in which IPAS centres are based to support integration there. So that's a new fund as of I believe it's 2023, but we'll be running that again this year. So that's a positive development. The last one I'm going to mention, and I'll definitely be accused of stretching things here, but going back to 2018, when labour market access was opened up to IP applicants, I think that's progress. Fine, it's 7 years ago, but the reason I mentioned actually is I think that the ESRI report doesn't make the direct link, but I think that clearly has to be a link between that measure and the improved employment outcomes for migrants of African origin. So that was interesting that came through quite strongly in the report. So I think we'll take a little bit of credit for that one. And so hopefully I haven't gone over time there, Alan.
No.
My initial comments.
Thanks so much, Colm. Actually, I mean, I better not take time to pick up on everything that everybody says, but it's an interesting point that the fact that we're measuring integration, but because there's a continuing inflow and a continuing increase in the size of the group that we're looking at, it actually does have implications for how you think about the pace of integration compared to a situation that you just had a static population. And almost by definition, I think this came up in some of the comments, the more recent arrivals are less likely to be integrated. So you're kind of constantly adding a pool of people who are less likely to be integrated. So at one level, I thought about that. Another level, I hadn't thought about a column. So you've kind of put it on the agenda. So thanks for that. But listen, we better move on. So our next discussant is Aideen Doherty from Donegal County Council. And Aideen, I know you have a role in service provision in this area in Donegal. So like Colm, we gave you a little bit of homework, and looking forward now to hearing your reflections. So are you there, Aideen?
Hello.
Hi, Aideen. How are you?
I'm okay. How you doing? They've disabled my video. Hang on, maybe somebody will start my video. Here we go. Good morning. How you doing?
So you are.
In the afternoon now, folks. Okay, so what I did in this instance is I've kind of gone in at it and taken all the questions in the round, and I want to go through each of the areas, if that's okay. And I'm going to start off by just presenting a little bit of context in relation to Donegal, if that's okay. And I'll just fire on, and I'm reading off page as well because I don't have a presentation for you. So just currently there are 10,507 refugees in Donegal, of which there are 8,449 Ukrainian BOTPs and 2,058 IPADs. We are hoping that some of these numbers will be verified through the recent re-registration programme, because our numbers sometimes are not in tallying up with those. So at the moment we have 37 commercial centres in Donegal, 12 of which are DACs. For those who don't know what DACs are, they're designated accommodation centres that provide full board. We have 886 people across 5 municipal districts in Donegal, so quite a large scattering of people all around the county. Interestingly, we have 82 centres that closed since January last year. So we had over 100 centres originally in Donegal, and the majority of those have been since last September. So you can imagine the impact that's had on the county. In the IPAS context, we have 30 centres. 2 of those are permanent, and 11 of those are on the main street in Letterkenny. There are 2,058 in total in those centres, of which 877 are children. I know I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you here, but I just want to help understand the context. We have 260 offer home properties, and there are 802 people in that. So basically the situation, the landscape in Donegal currently is that we have about 1,688 people in total in commercial or offer a home accommodation. And currently we have 6,761 approximately in what is the ARP or private rented accommodation that we cannot find within the county, if that makes sense. In other words, these people have been displaced, and the tracking and the data lost to us as a result of the relocations programme has created difficulties for all of the agencies. That said, people are integrating very well, but it just means that tracking piece that's really important to all of us is not as easy now. I think that in terms of the accommodation provision, and something that is very much on the agenda here in this county and across the country at the moment, is the Offer a Home programme. It has provided a massive opportunity here in the county in terms of integration, simply because people have somewhere to live. It's the last thing they're thinking about. They can go out into the community and they can find jobs and get employment opportunities in education. So if you get the accommodation piece right from the start, I think that really, really helps. And we saw that demonstrated here in Donegal very carefully through the IRRP scheme, which was a Syrian programme that came in here a number of years ago. This council made a decision to put people into homes, social housing, and all of those people are doing really well as a result. So I think that piece in relation to accommodation is what we should be really speaking about in terms of provision. That is not necessarily your 3-bed house with a garden front and back, but something else potentially. And I think that's where maybe the success might be in this regard. On English language provision, yes, we've had an excellent response from our ETB, and at local level, we have over nearly 1,500 people currently engaged in ESOL classes, which is incredible. And also we have our local university and voluntary sector helping as well in that regard. The biggest issue we're experiencing in that is around transport, actually. It's a massive county, and our community car and bus was crucial to Donegal, and that was a service that was unfortunately cut. The issues around childcare and other responsibilities basically are determining who can participate, because a lot of people can't get to the classes because they're in central locations. And I think that the policy regarding that, the delivery of those classes into the most local is really, really important, and to ensure that people are able to participate and people are able to engage. On the employment side of things, we've had very good success here, and we've had a lot of engineers making their way to the county on the basis that there are 2 global companies based in Donegal, and they're providing really good employment and employment supports. We also have seen a lot of nail technicians and food shops opening across the county from the cohorts that have come in. But again, the issue with English language continues to be a problem in this regard. And I think that the engagement piece around English language is very much, again, the formal classes, but the conversational piece is where we're trying to get our volunteers to move more into that place. Certainly self-employment opportunities are, the potential for that is huge here in the county, and we're really keen to work alongside the enterprise boards and the chambers here locally to see the value of the people that might be available. But key to that, I suppose, is connecting people with the relevant qualifications to the relevant opportunities. We would see here in the local authorities, we have a very difficult situation when securing engineers. And in the health service executives, we understand that there's real issues in securing people around specialist posts. We certainly have seen dentists and doctors come into this county, and we're trying to locate them appropriately. On the education side, we're looking really good attendance at school, and our early years right through to secondary school numbers have now stabilised. There are some pressure points, obviously, with young people travelling long distances, etc. But the qualifications piece around NIRAC is really, really important. But it's university based, so there's a whole pile of other professional qualifications maybe that are not being brought to the fore, and that understanding to be developed around that, so that we can get people into the right positions as indicated. There obviously has been an issue about people being able to participate in 3-year degrees because of the year-on-year approval in relation to the temporary accommodation. And that's creating massive problems, as you can imagine, for the universities who have the access courses and they can do those, but then that piece that allows students to transfer on. One of the things, I suppose, again, that, and Alan certainly, or I'm sorry, Colin certainly mentioned it, and I think it's absolutely essential, is that we do have the late now established in Donegal. We also have a community integration forum that is made up of the most senior personnel in Donegal. It is chaired by the Chief Executive of Donegal County Council, and we have the CEOs from all the agencies, the HSE, Donegal, the Department of Social Protection, and Garda Síochána, our local university, TUSLA, and the local development companies all participating in that. We made a decision that we wanted to have all the most senior decision makers at a strategic level participating, and issues are discussed and actioned there back into the LGMA, into the relevant government departments. The late then is a subgroup of that, and they are the frontline workers working in the voluntary community sector and all of the agencies, and they are meeting on a monthly basis to rub out some of the issues that they're experiencing every day. So that engagement piece is key with all the agencies as well. I suppose in terms of some of the stuff that we're trying to do to, I suppose, marry into what the program, what the report is intending, is we have made a determination that we are going to try and do an audit and skills analysis around that accommodation, education, employment, health and community. And we're doing it in the centres across the county. So we're hoping to get some really good data from that. And that is really around that active citizenship, about the sense of belonging and intention to stay. We're actually asking direct questions in that regard. We also have determined this year that we're looking at a GP survey, simply again to understand better the health outcomes of people. We're working with a network of GPs here in the county and the HSE to look at that. So that's kind of where we're at right now. I'm happy to, I'm not sure if I've answered all your questions, but I suppose it's just to give it an understanding of the service level that we have here in Donegal.
No, thanks so much, Aidan. Can I just ask a quick question? Okay.
Yes.
One of the great things about doing the job that I do is that I learn things on a daily basis. And so the local authority integration teams is something I was not aware of. Can you just take 30 seconds or a minute to say, like, what's the focus of those groups? And again, apologies for my ignorance, but
I mean, the local area integration teams are basically have been established across every local authority in the county, and they've been set up essentially to look at that whole integration piece. They are the first point of contact, I suppose, when people come in, but the intention is to create that sense of belonging, to work across all of those areas, to provide, I suppose, I'm trying to think of the word now. The word is to refer people into the various different services in order to support them in developing across those various different areas. So, I mean, the teams, there are teams of the integration worker is there as a person who's basically guiding and directing all of that. And it's managed by the local authorities, and as I say, all of the participants that are in it are coming from across all of the agencies in the county. So we have a very successful team established here in Donegal, and it's working really well in cooperation and collaboration. But essentially what it's doing is that they're the first point of contact when people come in. We're looking at the data analysis, we're looking at the referrals, we're looking at ways in which we can support them around accommodation provision and around education, employment, and all of the things basically that are identified in the report there.
No, thanks for that. It often strikes me when we have these sort of events that there can be more happening in the policy space, especially at a sort of a more local area than we might, or at least certainly that I was aware of. So anyway, sincere thanks for that, Aidan. Appreciate it. Better move quickly on to Salome. So Salome Mbagwe is Chief Executive of Akida. And Salome, I think you've been at events of ours previously, so it's great to have you back. And as ever, we look forward to your reflections on the integration monitor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alan, and thank you to the whole organization that has been involved in collecting this information. I've been actually involved in giving comment in the last 2 reports, so this is my 3rd one. And I deeply appreciate the continued effort for the ESLI and the Department of Children, Integration, and also Department of Justice for producing these reports. I must say that, these reports are crucial in helping us as a country to identify gaps in migrant integration and work towards a meaningful solution. They also continue to shape and inform our work, especially here in Akido in what we do, and ensuring that especially our work in advocacy as an organization and interventions are backed by solid evidence. So they give that evidence as well. And I know we were actually in connection with you when we launched our report there in November last year. So the ESLI report aligned closely with our own work on economic empowerment of migrant women, particularly our Empowered and Employment project that is funded currently by the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth under the Anti-Racism Funds. The report rightly emphasizes that migrant integration is a two-way process, requiring both proactive efforts from migrant and a responsive, informed approach from the host community. And I must also say that, it really speak to the volume based on what has been recurring in the previous, report that has been produced and that I have commented on. The notable improvement is a very welcome, outcome, and especially of the African migrant, which I have also noted previously. And this has also been noted by other researches that has been done, and other work in particular that I've been involved in, especially, on Black women in the labor market, and also the very recent one that has been produced on equity at workplace by Boone Joseph, being the auditor of that. So there's quite a lot of information out there, which is actually re-emphasizing what this report by ESLI is saying, which is a welcome progress indeed. I also want to confirm and re-emphasize what Quorum have observed. The right to work for people seeking international protection in 2018 must have contributed to this progress. But also we have international students coming into Ireland, and as well, we also have second generation of migrant, that maybe they weren't able to work at the time when this other report has been done. They were maybe in college, but now they are working, of which we have noted in Akido, they are working in, international companies, most of them, such as Google, such as TikTok, and these other companies, international companies where most of the second generation children of migrants are being able actually to work. When looking at this, and looking at the international protection and, migrant in general, we must also question ourselves, what kind of jobs are they doing? Is it decent work? Is that job that matches their qualifications? And I know qualifications comes in, in the question as well. And given that, the report shows that they're also highly qualified, the report, I must reaffirm further analysis is required to understand the nature and quality of these jobs, because it's important to know what kind of jobs are these, and the factor that is driving into these changes as well, because we're articulating them now. One of the barriers highlighted both in our research in Akidwa on employment and empowered and the ESLI report is the knowledge gap surrounding immigration, permission, and work eligibility, whether it's in terms of student, whether it's in terms of, the international applicant, that many employers remain unfamiliar with the legal frameworks governing migrant employment, resorting into unnecessary barriers to hiring skilled individuals. Despite being highly educated and eager to work, migrants in particular face disproportionate difficulties accessing employment due to this misconception, including even in public jobs, when maybe they are also, have the right to work even in public jobs, that this confusion is still there. And in this, actually, Akido has made significant recommendations, including, setting up a program, especially for international applicants to be able to gain work experience, like just what we have in C scheme, because most of them, when it comes to 6 months and they are allowed to work, they are still asked for work experience when they are looking for work. And you would find that it will go up to 9 months or even than a year before they work. Well, the right to work is, a very welcome progress, and it's showing significant change and progress. We didn't need to think of reducing this maybe to 3 months or scrapping it completely, but coming up with programs that will help people to work, because report shows that migrants are very willing to work and they're already engaged at work. To address this, Akido has taken a direct action through phase 2 of our Employed and Empowered project funded by Department of Children, offering free trainings to employers in partnership with Progoman. This initiative aimed to bridge the knowledge gap and equip business with the tools they need to hire and integrate migrant workers effectively. So this could help a lot. Looking into key policy priorities, because I don't want to take a lot of time, I'm given time. I just want to say that, one of the things that can be done, in addressing in particular the issues of poverty is addressing the income disparity and in-work poverty. While migrant employment rates are high, wages remains low. Policy should focus on wages equity, salary and pay transparency, which most of the time is not there, that people even are not told, of how much they are being paid. And we've heard from the people who come here in Akido that some of them are still being paid, under minimum wage. We have to prevent wages discrimination, and this has to be linked with the, some of the tools that we have and strategies that we have, like the NAPA. That compensation must be paid for pay discrimination. If it's found that there's pay discrimination, that these people must be actually compensated, and ensure anti-discrimination measures in hiring. And that's why our training, for example, with employers is very important, because it addresses issues of biases, and also stronger anti-discrimination and biases training is needed, because all this will support into helping employers to understand more. I know we have spoken a lot about the recognitions of foreign qualifications, because it shows that migrants are very highly qualified. But when we come to look at the jobs that they are working on, it's really mainly concentrated in care work, and also, other jobs, that doesn't matches their qualifications. And this is an issue that needed to be looked into as a matter of urgency. We also have to have targeted maybe support for low-income migrants, because we know it's not everybody who will go for those higher income jobs based on the language barrier and the other issues that are there. And given the rising cost of living, social protection policy should include targeted support for low-income migrant households, ensuring equitable access to financial assistance, issues like childcare, which affect most of the people that we work with here in Akido, and upskilling opportunities, including also things like mentoring services. In terms of housing, I wanted to comment on that, and migrants trying to transit from direct provision as well, who faces significant challenges, because you have an issue of housing, not only for migrants, but, in the country in general, we have this problem. But I also want to mention that we have worked with migrants who want to access finances to be able to buy houses or to have mortgages, but it's very, very difficult. It becomes extremely difficult for migrants who want to access maybe loans or even deposit to be able to have their own houses or mortgages. But getting a house, and decent house where you don't have to do a lot of work, or it's in an area that you'll be able to access, because like we have heard from other speakers, that accessibility, like Aiden actually, accessibility is a key issue, and it's a key problem with many people that actually we hear from in our work here in Akido. I also wanted to mention, in terms of policy, the whole area of data collection on ethnicity and integration, that this is an area that we still need to improve on. A lack of detailed ethnic data limits our understanding of migrant experiences. We didn't need to get that, really like inside experiences. And we, as Akido, we advocate for inclusion of migrant-specific indicators in national surveys to track integration outcomes, identity, and also issues of social belonging. Special surface module, and this has been mentioned by the report, and ethnic minority boost samples, and they can help to implement and allow for better policies areas. Looking at the whole area of, because I will not mention in all areas, I just wanted to mention on my final area of comment of where we have seen progress, and progress has been there. It's not actually like, when we started our organization in 2001, we have seen progress, and we have named some of them, like the right to work of people seeking international protection, them being actually also given the right to, open bank account, driving license as well, so that they can be able to access jobs and all this. So we have seen all this, but you have also seen increase in funds, especially for the Department of Children, Disability, Youth, and Integration. And that's what is actually helping some of our organizations like Akido to be able to do the work that we are doing with migrants who need to go to the employment, by helping them and preparing them to enter into the labor market and all that. So this funding needs to continue, and it needs actually to be more, so that it can help people that need it more. Also, the concentrating on the local authorities, this has been mentioned, the importance of having programs and projects and incorporating and working together with local authorities, because integration started where people live. It's very, very important that, we continue with this integration project that has actually now been located in all the county councils. In Akido, we've had conversations with, for example, Dublin City Council, and we have actually been providing training to most of the local authorities through RIAT. So this is the step forward to, and the way to do things. I think this is a very huge progress, and I would actually highlight it as a progress that is there and that can be seen. And though it has helped actually in supporting people. Also, the expansion of naturalization. Helping people to receive citizenship so that they can be able to contribute more with confidence and invest more, because we also have entrepreneurs who are not part of this research as well. We've also seen in the political participation of migrants, the numbers that have increased, in recent years, especially last year. But still, this progress marks an important step in enhancing representation and voices of migrants in general, although it needs to improve. So this report, for me, in conclusion, reinforces the importance of collective responsibility in migrant integration. While migrants are actively contributing to Ireland economy and society, they continue to face barriers, because that's what we hear, that require policy intervention and societal awareness. And so there are a lot of attitudes out there, but we really need to raise this more awareness for the society to see what contributions the migrants are bringing, but also the key challenges that they continue to face. And I think this is very important that, this kind of research is more deepened, to be able to give us a better understanding. And in terms of data, it should also be able to have disaggregated data that also inform us in terms of gender, disability, that intersectionality that we would want to know. So thank you so much. Those are just my comments for now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Salome. As ever, your comments are very, very insightful, and we really appreciate them. Now, unfortunately, we're really, really tight on time, but a number of questions have come in through the chat function. So I'm going to kind of gather a range of questions, and I can see, Kira, you're back on the screen if others want to join. But a lot of the questions have run along the lines of whether or not certain groups have been included, okay? So people have asked about children and young people. They've also asked about Roma, and they've asked about people in collective accommodation. Okay, so those are areas where I have a feeling you haven't, but you might want to sort of reflect on whether or not these groups, should be looked at and how that might happen. And that sort of goes into the broader question that, Kira, you sort of touched on it, where you talked about the need for additional information. So I guess the question is, if we're going to be, say, sitting here in 2 years' time when the next integration report is out, what would be the hopes for the additional data? So 2 strands there, and anybody who wants to jump in. Roma, young people, collective accommodation, were they there or not? And what are the data needs? So Kira, do you want to kick off, and then colleagues can pitch in?
Yeah. Absolutely. So I can give a little, so collective accommodation is one that is an increasing issue. And it's not that we excluded it from this report, it's that they're excluded from these surveys, which are these big European quarterly surveys run by the CSO with really large sample sizes that look, it's the labour force survey and the survey on income and living conditions. So these are designed to analyse the entire population, to give regular data on the labour force and on, how people's lives are going and poverty rates, etc. They're not designed for migrant integration. And the methodology is kind of the same basically across time and across Europe. So it's that these surveys which give us this information don't survey collective accommodation centres, which used to be an issue when, you know, there was 3,000, 4,000 people in collective accommodation centres for asylum, but is much bigger issue now that we're talking about, you know, close to 70,000 or 100,000 at certain points in this period of time. So that's definitely an area, and we try to kind of look at administrative data there, but it's that's part of the issue. Anusha responded for Roma. They're not disaggregated in this, but we did publish a recent report on attitudes, and she also responded with a very useful one on how children fared based on GUI data. You know, children are looked at in this as well. So maybe America can comment on how they're included in the education, looking at early school leaving and reading and maths outcomes at the age of 15 as well. And of course, children are also incorporated into the poverty factors, because you're looking, you know, it's based on household, et cetera, but maybe kind of child specific poverty indicators could also be an interesting one to look at. And the question of, you know, how you would make this better, the EMN, the European Migration Network, actually did a really interesting piece of research on monitoring integration recently, looking at how other European countries do it as well. And I think that's a really useful resource. And things like being able to ask about sense of belonging, sense of like kind of, you know, how much you identify with your local area, how much you identify with the country, are kind of these integration specific ideas that you could ask in a specific survey. So there's plenty of questions there, so I don't know if others want to come in on that as well.
Yeah,
I just very briefly wanted to say that we have previously done some research on young people of migrant origin. For example, in 2022, myself and my colleagues, we published a report called Children of Migrants, How They Are Faring. Although we didn't look at integration per se, we looked at certain outcomes, so for example, reading and self-concept, but it's also gave really interesting insight into how these young people are doing in Ireland. So there is scope using the GUI data to look at quite a number of different areas, you know, and now that's a different way data is becoming available. It's also possible to look at changes over time, which is a really valuable contribution of the GUI in this and other areas.
Great, thanks for that. I mean, actually, just on Salome's contribution, it does strike me that job quality is another area that I think and again, I mean, I don't know if it's possible with the data available, but it's almost like the next challenge from an integration perspective. It's one thing to have people employed, but making sure that people are able to access the sort of, you know, it's equal opportunity to a certain degree, but it's slightly broader than that, and I think it would be great to have something on that. So there's always the next challenge. Okay, I hate to wrap things up, but we always try and end at the advertised time. So I want to thank Aidan, Colm and Salome for coming along and giving actually really well thought out reflections on the report. So sincere thanks to that. And of course, thanks to Colm's department and the Department of Justice for working with us and all this. I'm not going to list all the contributors because there's too many, but congrats to everybody who worked on the report, and then especially thanks to Ciara and Evan for contributing on the presentation this morning. So I guess we will be doing this again whenever the next monitor comes along. It's always such an important and interesting exercise. But with that, just wish everybody a good rest of the day. So bye-bye.